Welcome to Grad School Week. Today is Wednesday's event around personal statements. And here we've pulled together a team of experts that are going to help guide you through the personal statement portion of the graduate school application process. If you've attended the previous sessions this week, you know part of the application package includes things like your resume, a transcript, perhaps letters of recommendation, and some type of personal statement. And we know we hear the feedback all the time. This is perhaps one of the more daunting elements of it. So we're going to provide you all kinds of tools with success to do that, and recognize it is one part of the overall package. So before we jump into it, just by way of introduction, my name is Bob McMahon. I'm a senior career coach at the University Career Center. And I'll let Darla introduce herself, and we'll work our way up the slide.
Everybody, I'm Darla Himelis. I'm the assistant director over at the Writing Center, and I will put my contact information in the chat. We work with students all the time on personal statements over at the Writing Center, and I would be happy to help connect you with our services.
And I'm Barbara Gorka. I'm Director of Scholar Development and Fellowships Advising. We also work with students on personal statements, most frequently for scholarship and fellowship applications, but also for students applying for graduate school. So we're an additional resource for all of you.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Kimberly Bucksbeck. I'm the Director of Pre-Professional Health Advising. My office supports students who are pursuing professional school, and it's great to see many of you in our audience today. So we're working directly with students with their application preparation and doing a lot of support for personal statements in general.
Great. Now that we've got that out of the way, let me just do a quick little bit of housekeeping. This is the outline for today, what you can expect us to cover. We'll also, of course, have room at the end for any questions that you may have during as a result of this session, I should say. To kick things off, let's just kind of give an overview of what is a personal statement, what's involved with it. It is an indication of your priorities and your interests. It's a written version of this. It's also a story, but most particularly, it's your story. It's not the right story or the perfect story. It's your story. It's a narrative, an argument, if you will, and it is a reflective resume, all of these things at once. So for sure, this is a complicated piece of writing. As a narrative, if we break this apart, it's about your academic and career trajectory. You're connecting dots between, most often, the past, the present, and the future. Now, the questions that you might be confronted with for a personal statement are going to vary from field to field, school to school, even within the same field, between different schools and their requirements. So it's hard to say that there is one format that you can just model and it'll work everywhere. With that in mind, some of the questions you could expect to be confronted with are: what led you to your interests in this profession or field of study, right? What's the thing that makes you want to do this? What are you doing right now, or maybe in the little bit in the past, to prepare for graduate school and those future goals? You know, what happens after? If applicable, do you know what you want to study or research or specialize in? Depending on the type of program you're applying to, you may have to really be specific in saying, I want to study this particular kind of chemistry, or I want to study this specific era of history. What type of work or research do you see yourself doing after you complete the degree, or what are your career goals? This is a very much forward-looking question, and it might be hard to answer. You may not have thought about it. I think for many folks, it's I just want to get into the school. I'll figure it out later. And I think that's a totally legitimate feeling to have. But for the purposes of this writing, you'll have to sort of think ahead. Okay, if I get this degree in whatever, what's going to happen with it next? And if you don't know exactly, you could dream about it, and maybe that becomes your goal. As a narrative, you want to be engaging, interesting, and uniquely you. Use your voice. Don't write as if you're somebody else. In order to make a persuasive case, you have to ask yourself, you really have to do a lot of reflection about yourself. And this can be hard too, but you want to carve out some space and time and be intentional about this. And think about experiences that have helped you prepare to excel in this program or the field, career, whatever in the future. So think about things like coursework, research you might be doing, internships, volunteering that you've done, student organizations that you belong to and have been doing something in. This as a whole collective can help inform and be part of the groundwork for the preparation you've been making to excel in this thing that you're now going to go after. Think about why you belong in that specific program or school. You may have to actually name that. Why do you belong here? Why do you want to go here? There are some exceptions, one of which is where there's a common application. And I'm thinking about medical school programs, for example, where you apply in one central portal and the answer is the same for everybody. So you aren't going to be that specific. I want to attend Duke's medical school because you're going to use the same personal statement across many different schools. You want to keep it professional, of course, the tone, but it's not super academically formal, if that makes sense. This is in part a reflective resume. And I like that phrase because you're going to reflect some of the content of your resume, but you're not going to want to list it. This isn't a narrative version of the bullet points under your resume. You may point to different things. You may highlight these key academic, volunteer, or work internship experiences that show, hey, this is how I'm ready. I'm telling you I'm ready, and let me show you how that is from this example in my past. You reflect on your experiences, and it's a key to set yourself apart from other applicants. Often we're confronted with that question of how do I make myself look different or better than the other applicants? And I think that's hard because you don't know who they are and what they have, right? But what we do know is what makes you special, right? And you may not know it right away. It may take some time to figure that out, but that really is the thing. What is unique, distinctive, impressive about you or your life story? What details of your life, thinking about personal or family, history, people, events that have shaped or influenced you, that might help a committee better understand you and help set you apart from other applicants. Up next, Kim's going to talk to you about some pitfalls to avoid.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. So Bob highlighted how a personal statement becomes your narrative. It's also an argument and a reflective resume. I think a word that totally resonates with me and that I encourage all of you to think about when developing your personal statement is the fact that this is a reflective writing piece. And to the points that I'm about to talk about, I ask that on top of the reflective writing mentality, that when developing your personal statement, that you be connected to your own writing and also to stay connected with everything that you include in your personal statement. So think of this piece as a connection. And so with this connective mentality, I ask that we're going to try to avoid some of the common pitfalls to kind of stick to that, making a connection with what you write and what you include. So for example, when you develop a personal statement, we try to have you avoid making statements such as, I am passionate about something. And what we've used in this slide is a statement, I am passionate about German. We want to take that phrase a little bit further. So finding a connection behind something that you are passionate about. So in other words, we want you to show, don't just tell us. So we want you to give a connected example to that phrase about you being passionate about something. That is a pitfall that we would want for you to avoid making in your personal statement. I think it's great to express how you are passionate, interested in something in particular, considering that your personal statement is focused on one field. But we also need to show the reader about how you are one of those things that you list. Another thing that we encourage students to do is avoid general statements such as, I like to help people. And I see this a lot in my world, especially among pre-health students. But again, we want to hear a little bit more about what that means to you. And also this statement in general is a bit cliche. You want to make sure when you're developing your personal statement to avoid cliche statements like this. So what we encourage for you to do, and what many of my students in the audience have probably heard me say, is to be very specific and to provide examples that are connected with everything that you've done so far, and perhaps connected to a potential theme that you end up running through your statement. Everything needs to be connected and connected about you and what you bring. What we also suggest too is avoid getting too personal in your statement. Many of you might already be restricted to a certain number of character limits. So basically you have a limited amount of space to write your narrative and to be reflective. So you want to avoid being too personal. And unless that is very connected to the story in which you bring throughout your personal statement, you want to leave being too personal very short in your statement. If this is something traumatic but important to your application, it might be important to mention, but also highlight some of the strengths that came out of the situation if you do decide to bring up something personal. What we also suggest as well, I'm a sucker for a great story. And with a great story, I think comes with a theme, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to start your story or your personal statement with something catchy just to grab the reader's attention. If a phrase or if there's something that connects to what your narrative is going to be, that would be appropriate, but you don't necessarily need to approach your statement with something catchy just to get the reader's attention. We say that the personal statement is about you. It's not necessarily a creative writing a statement, but you're using this as an opportunity to talk about your experiences and what you bring to the field. So I guess I'm reiterating something that I mentioned before. Another pitfall to avoid is giving your entire life story. I say we want to avoid doing that because of the character limits, but also at the same time, we're not necessarily using the personal statement as a repeat of the resume. We are highlighting really those meaningful experiences that stand out most to you and that you can connect with most. So generally speaking, all of you are preparing for either a professional school, graduate school, next step. And so the focus should be on the work that we've done as an undergraduate, all the academic, professional development pieces that add up to your story. So unless they're extremely influential to you with what you've done in high school that have brought you to this point, you want to basically focus on just the experiences that you've developed as an undergrad. Bob had mentioned a personal statement using your authentic voice and that you want the statement to sound like you, and that is totally true. The personal statement is an opportunity for an admissions committee to get an opportunity to meet you. So this is the piece that really stands out on your application to give that admissions committee the why they should invite you into an interview. And we want the statement to sound like you. We don't want you to necessarily use big words to make yourself stand out. And if we have any friends, fans in the audience, you might, the scene that we're about to show you might look familiar to you, but it's just a little comic example of what we're talking about. You want to avoid this.
I don't understand.
Some of the words a little too sophisticated for you.
It doesn't make any sense.
Well, of course it does. It's smart. I used a thesaurus.
On every word?
Yep.
What was this sentence originally?
Oh, they are warm, nice people with big hearts.
And that became, they're humid, prepossessing Homo sapiens with full-sized aortic pumps.
Yeah, and hey, I really mean it, dude.
So while it might seem like the right thing to maybe write with bigger words, it's not necessarily sounding like you, and it's not necessarily needed when writing your personal statement. So you want to strive to write clearly, concisely, and direct and to the point. It should sound like the natural you, but in a professional way. Okay, these are the last points to just keep in mind. Again, with that thought of being connected with everything that you decide to include in your personal statement. Essentially, those highlights that really mean the most about you. The personal statement is indeed about you. It's not necessarily about writing about somebody else, such as your parents, or maybe a societal issue, something that you care about. If you indeed connect with what you decide to write about, that's something different. But in the end, everything that you decide to include in your personal statement is something connected deeply to you. So again, it's this opportunity for an admissions committee to get to want to know you more. And again, with the repeat of the resume, this is not the opportunity to use this, your resume, to expand out on your resume for your personal statement. So you want to just concentrate on those very specific things that mean the most to you and make the connections between your experiences to truly showcase your preparedness for this very next step. Keeping in mind too, that your personal statement does not need to be approached chronologically. So if you are talking about things out of order, but there is a very good flow and understanding behind it, that is completely appropriate. And next, we are going to take a look at some statement prompts and do a little exercise. So I'm going to pass it off to my colleague and friend, Barbara.
Right. So Dan just asked how long the personal statements tend to be, and that's going to vary by institution. But here we do, two of these sample prompts list 500 words, and I would say that that's probably pretty typical. But you could see with our second prompt, they're saying about 2 pages. Now, do they mean 2 pages single spaced or double spaced? Again, you're going to, in most cases, you're going to get pretty specific prompts. So you just have to follow what they say. Here we have a couple of samples. In the first one, pretty typical. An essay of about 500 words, state your purpose in undertaking graduate study at fill in the blank school. As part of your statement of purpose, describe your academic and research interests, career objectives, and how a degree from the school will enable you to achieve your goals. Please be specific. Notice that it's not asking for your biography or autobiography. It's not asking for your entire life. It's very specific to academic and research trajectory. You might get one that's a little bit harder to address because it's not as specific. Please attach a statement of about 2 pages describing important or unusual aspects of yourself, not otherwise apparent in your application. The very vague third prompt, so all of the pre-health students, you probably are used to this one. Tell us why you want to be a physician. But again, if you get a prompt that is that broad, you can often take it back to that first prompt or the first sample that I give, because that would be what is kind of expected when you're asked something like, why do you want to be fill in the blank? You might get some universities that have a more specific prompt, like we see in the fourth one, that is asking you to go beyond academic and professional to potentially include something about cultural, geographic, financial, educational, citizenship status, etc. And this is probably a university or university system that is attempting to increase diversity in their graduate programs. I see a lot of the University of California school system has an additional sort of diversity personal statement. So again, what you include on some level might be dictated by the prompt itself. So pay attention to it. Okay, next. Oh, I guess I can change, go to the next slide. So we're going to see a couple of samples here. Now we're just going to look at sample opening paragraphs because it would probably take too much time for you to read a 500-word essay. So for each one, we'll give you a little time to read it, and then we'll discuss what works well so far, if anything, and what you would recommend that the applicant do to further develop their ideas. Like, do you see a sentence where you think that they could expand a little bit more in their next draft? And after reading it, feel free to give your thoughts in chat or unmute yourself and let us know what you think about this. Okay, so the first example. Oh, there we go. Okay, take a minute to read it. Okay, so what do you all think? Thinking about the advice, the tips that we gave and some of the pitfalls that we also recommended avoiding, what do you see the student doing? Don't be shy.
Personally, I think it's a bit too like formal in the language.
Okay, a little formal in the language. Laura, can you be more precise? Do you feel that it's formal or?
Like it's formal, but like the words they're using are like a little overshooting, and it just seems a little like weird. I don't know.
Absolutely. When the student talks, I mean, this is where we both Robert and Kimberly were talking about using clear, precise language. Simple language is better than words we wouldn't use in conversation. So could you give an example? Sorry to put you on the spot, Laura. Can you give an example of one of these words that we wouldn't say?
Well, in the first sentence, I've always had the propensity to obtain a legal education. Like it's just like I don't think
Propensity,
anyone talks like that.
jurisprudential system. What is the
I
student
don't even
mean
know
by?
what that is.
I mean, again, really what they're saying, like, I've always wanted to go to law school. That's what they're saying. Okay, but let's take that. If they start their essay with "I always wanted to go to law school," and they're applying for law school, does that sentence help them stand out in any way?
No.
No. You can all say like, so this gets to that thing of like, you want to be thinking about how to make yourself unique, right? And you might, as Bob said, you don't know who else is applying, but you can be sure that just about every other applicant to law school has always had an interest in going to law school. So doesn't help them. Okay, so what else do you see? Big words and more complicated than they need. But what else?
Though they do say that they have this great interest, they don't explain that in any way. They just say, oh, I'm interested without saying like, oh, these are the things that show my interest over time.
Tasneem, that's great. That's great. That's the idea that they are telling, not showing. So this is a perfect example of somebody who's telling us that they've been interested, but not showing us that interest. What else? There's another really important place where they're telling and not showing.
I think they also kind of like where they're saying like I'm convinced my personal and professional background would add immeasurably. Like that's more so telling than not actually showing in a way where you want to see more of action and like, okay, what personal and professional backgrounds, like you haven't really listed anything or said anything that kind of helps that. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
This is again, this is the example, and the student probably some homework to see that the school values diversity and is telling them like, oh, I'm going to help your diversity, but doesn't show it in any way. So the telling, not showing, is really, really typical in early drafts. It's almost like our natural inclination to do that. But, if I were meeting with the student, I would find it a pretty easy case to sit down with them and say like, okay, well, let's come up with some examples. This would probably be an easy opening paragraph to turn into a much more effective one. Is there anything else you find here that maybe doesn't belong or is not necessary, like sort of a waste of real estate? Because remember, they're going to have all of the students' application materials, transcripts, scores, letters of recommendation. So
Definitely the LSAT score at the bottom and their work experience that's already going to be written on their resume and in their transcripts.
exactly. So not necessary to point that out. Same thing with like mentioning a GPA. That's not necessary. Now, if there's pertinent work experience that really shows their interest in going to law school, absolutely, it's okay to reflect on things in your resume. You don't want to just refer to them or reference them without sort of that reflection. So great. I'll say that our samples here tend to exaggerate a little bit to make the point, but this is a pretty typical first draft from a lot of the essays that I read. So doesn't matter what it looks like in the first draft, it matters what it looks like in the final one. Okay, we're going to move to another one. Okay. Okay, Drew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, to me, this just seems kind of like a word salad, honestly. Like it really doesn't say much at all. I mean, they're talking about like their positive upbringing, I guess, but that really does nothing in the sense of talking about their professional development at all. So I think it's just too much emphasis on the emotional side of their life where they're lacking in the professional aspect of
So
it.
nothing professional. What else? Anisha, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly?
Yep, that was correct. I see that it's completely repetitive. Like, they're saying the exact same thing in almost every single sentence throughout. And they're also referencing, like their parents and what they have done, which doesn't really tell us anything about them and what experiences they've had in life that would make them actually a good candidate.
Right. Again, so same idea. They're referencing their parents, but really we know very little about this person. Anything else? Do you all like this person? Tianjua? I'm not saying that correctly, but
You were close. It was Tianja.
Tianja.
Yeah, but I was just gonna speak on that too. I feel like a lot of it is kind of braggadocious and not really humble in any way. And I feel like some of the esteem the student may have for themselves is coming from external factors and external conversations rather than like experiences they've had themselves and things that internally would make them feel that way. And then going into what their family doesn't help in at least fit with what they're trying to say.
Right. Like it does seem to be lacking in humility. And I know it's really hard. We're telling that you have to find ways to sell yourself, but you also have to be humble. But this student doesn't even make any attempt to be humble, right? Like it's sort of everyone thinks I'm great and therefore I'm going to be a doctor. And if I'm not mistaken, Kimberly, this was an actual draft that you received years ago, correct?
Yep, that is correct. And it came a long way from this one.
So again, everyone, just know that we're showing you first drafts, not final ones. And also know that don't worry about submitting a draft to any of us. It would be years before we would use it in a session like this, and always without any name. So yes. So again, this is like just a perfect, we want to get to know you. And in this case, I feel like I don't know anything about them except for being privileged and not very humble. And we don't even really know why they want to be a doctor. So you want to avoid this kind of opening sentence, opening paragraph. Okay, let's move on to make sure we have enough. Okay, there we go. This one is a pretty, a one error issue, so it should be pretty quick. Okay, what do you all see here?
Everything is anecdotal and not about the applicant. It's just about their family history. So it doesn't tell you anything about what the applicant is passionate about or why they're applying.
Right. I read this and I'm like, well, I like Grandma Betty, too bad she's not applying for this program. But yes, that's it. This is an example of specifically that. It's very easy to write about other people. It's harder to write about yourself. So I understand this approach. The alternative, another approach that we often see is students who, we had that the pitfall about talking about a social issue that you care a lot about. This is another version of that. Talking about that societal issue that you care about is fine as long as you're turning it into action and how it's influenced you. So this student, again, could potentially shorten the whole part about Grandma Betty and turning it more into what that inspiration led to. Great. Okay. That one was really just wanted to show you that one sample, and then we'll get to this. I can get to the fourth one. Here we go. So what do you think? Any thoughts about this one? Does it help if I give you the hint that this was a final version, not a first draft?
It does have a very clear sense of direction.
Yes. So clear sense of direction. What else? What else do you think works? Anybody? What else do you think works in this opening paragraph?
I think that because they started with like an event that kind of led to them wanting a career in that field. I liked that they spoke about how it did that and not just about like how the event made them feel and go too much into the emotional aspect. They just spoke about what that made them do and how that furthered their path.
Exactly. And this is a student I worked with in his early drafts. It was very emotional. But then it moved to that direct action. What did it make when this happened? What did it motivate you to do? And that's the new focus here. So I'm sure if I ask how many of you have changed your majors during your time, and really this was a big change from architecture to political science, that can be not always, but it can potentially be an effective story to open with. It's got to be short, and it can't go into bashing your former major. It's much more, why did I find this new major to be such a good fit for my path? But that's a pretty common sort of that change of major or something that shifted as an undergraduate can be turned into an effective opening paragraph. Anyone else have any comments on this one?
I think they did a good job connecting the dots between the past, the present, and the future. So what piqued their interest, and then what they are gonna study or do in the future. So it flows very well.
It is very
overall.
it's sort of what we would call an economy of expression, saying a lot with the little words. And again, this isn't something that's going to happen in a week. Somebody had asked before, how when should you start working on this? Well, we'll get to that. I mean, others can chime in, but give yourself as much time as you can. I would say 2 months would be great. You could go longer, but you want to be able to give yourself time to do a draft, meet with somebody, talk about it, let it set it aside, come back to it. It's hard to do that in a week. You're not setting yourself up for success. Okay, so I hope that these samples have helped you. As I said, the first 3 were all sort of exaggerated examples of certain pitfalls. And hopefully this final one is a good example of sort of how you can pull all this together, tell us something about yourself, showing us something about what you really care about. And then we'll be detailing this I remember in a past session, some students have said like, well, they throw in this military service and I have no idea where that comes from. Well, in the next paragraph, it sort of serves as a transition to the next paragraph. As I said, you're seeing a snapshot here, not the entire essay. Okay. I think, Bob, you're taking it from here.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to walk through those examples and see those different pitfalls. I really do enjoy that exercise. Actually, is quite helpful because they're common. Like, I think we all would agree that those of us that review these things, yeah, we see this. So these are really typical. It doesn't mean that if you do it, there's something deficient about you or you're a bad writer. This is a process. So with that in mind, here's some additional tips. Some of these may sound repetitive, and they are because it's important to hammer these home. So where do you start? First and foremost, you have to identify the essay requirements. So if we go back to, if you attended Monday's event, which was like a grad school overview, part of that process is actually narrowing down where you're going to apply. So you can't start writing your personal statement before you've selected the places you want to apply to. So it's really important to do that first. Once you have now identified the essay requirements for each and every school you're applying to, one approach that helps make this personal statement writing a bit less painful is build an outline from those essay requirements. So you saw in some of the samples earlier, there were a couple key points to pick out. How did you get prepared? What are your future goals? What are your research interests? There's an outline hiding in there. So you can use that as a starting point. Consider these particular core themes, incorporating them into your personal statement, because you likely are going to be asked about this in either directly or in an oblique way. What's your motivation and your interest? What are your experiences and skills? What are your goals? Now, they could be goals in graduate school. You know, what do you hope to accomplish there? And then pretty good chance you're going to need to explain what your future goals are. And then lastly, should you be chronological? And I think we talked about this earlier. Maybe, but not necessarily. This isn't something that you have to march through a particular timeline. It's more important really to think about what are the essay requirements and then go from there. Some additional tips, and I think some of these are going to dovetail nicely with what Barbara was just talking about. Be prepared to write multiple drafts. This is not the kind of exercise where if you are a person that writes that research paper the night before or that weekend, you can do that for this, but it's not going to be really successful. Start writing early, as early as you can. Once you've identified those programs and you say, yes, I'm applying here, there's a good time to start figuring out what are the prompts, what's an outline to follow. Remember to directly answer the question in the prompt. I hope you're getting the message here that it's important for you to look at the prompt and answer it. I've seen some really great pieces of writing, I'm sure we all have, that do not answer the questions. I've read some stuff written by really bright people, and the question is one line. It's a simple question. For example, why do you want to be a doctor? And it's a great story, and I have no idea at the end why they want to be a doctor. So focus on the prompt. Seek feedback from others. And you can see we've added some clues on what we think others means. I'll add here perhaps qualified others, experienced in the area others, folks that see this type of work a lot. It's hard for friends and family to provide feedback because most likely they'll say, oh, this is the best piece of writing I've ever seen, right? They don't want to hurt your feelings. They're going to see you that weekend for dinner. They don't want it to be awkward, right? They also just don't know. So folks at the Writing Center, excellent resource there. Barbara's Fellowships Advising folks, the pre-professional health folks. Here at the Career Center also, your academic advisor is a possible resource, and even conceivably some professors could be willing and able to help you with a draft at least of this writing, offering some opinions. But the key thing here is seek feedback. Don't just write this in a vacuum by yourself and then submit it. Proofread, proofread, proofread. And then give it to somebody else to proofread. Proofread from bottom to top. Figure it out, but you want to be sure there aren't any errors in there. In terms of the resources, I listed them out here. These are links to the Writing Center, Fellowships Advising, the Career Center, and the Pre-Professional Health Advising folks. And as we come into the conclusion of our talk today, and we'll open it up to any more questions you have, I wanted to just preview for you tomorrow's event. If you haven't registered for it, I encourage you to. If you're not able to, register anyway. It'll be recorded. We'll alert you when that recording's available. If you've registered, you'll be able to get that notification. But this is the culminating piece of grad school week that sort of hopefully will tie together everything for you and focus on the overall application, how to make that overall competitive grad school application. These are experts, like I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, in the field. These are folks that either are or were behind that black curtain. When you hit submit, they're the ones that see these things. They can tell you what happens, what they're looking at. It's a great insider's view. So I encourage you to register for this. If you can attend, great. If you can't, you can at least see the recording. And with that, I open the floor to any questions through any way you wish to ask them, unmute in the chat. And I also want to thank you all for attending and your engagement. It's been really great to hear your thoughts about these.
Oh yeah, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Oh yeah, so I was wondering, I'm taking my gap year right now, and I just graduated in the spring of 2023, from Temple. Would I be able to still go to the writing center, to get help with my graduate essay?
The answer to that question, Darla, just included in the chat is a big yes.
Oh, great.
And if you are an alumni in the audience, please feel free to reach out to Darla directory, and she's included her email in the chat.
And I can also say that Fellowships Advising works with alumni on graduate school personal statements, but not from mid-August through the end of October, which is our peak advising period for fellowships. So beyond that, most deadlines are depending on the program, December or January, so it usually works fine for us as well.
The Career Center also is available not only just for the personal statements, but resumes, any of those things for alums, unlimited access, just as if you were a student for a full year after graduation. So if you graduated in May of 23 till May of 24, and then after that, a couple of times a year. So it's still an option for you. I put a link in the chat.
And I'll also say to any of our pre-professional students in the audience that our office will continue to support you as you work towards your application. We are seeing more and more of our alumni who are pursuing what I like to call growth years after they graduate from undergrad to the pursuit of professional school. So please make sure to stay in touch with us as well.
I love that, growth years.
Thank you.
Growth years, and what was the braggadocious?
Yes, that was great.
These are two things I'm going to write down that I've learned.
So I mentioned in chat that if there's interest in talking about the difference between, say, a personal statement for a PhD program admission to perhaps a professional school or master's degree, I don't want to talk about that if there's no interest. So if there's interest, if you want to give a thumbs up, and if not, we can just take any other question. Okay. Are there any other? Okay, we have one. I would just say that really briefly that if you're applying for a PhD program, your essay, your personal statement will be largely about research, and you should really be able to talk about the kind of research that you want to do. Almost think of it as the academic autobiography, your evolution as a researcher. It's going to trend more towards that unless the prompts tell you otherwise. So it might feel less personal, but there should still be reflection in that evolution as a researcher. And I think there's plenty of us, faculty are great for this as well, because they generally have PhDs and read PhD applications, perhaps in their own department. So please, if you're applying to PhD programs, our offices are great, but you should also be working with somebody in your department to make sure that the content is sound. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
I think I might have missed it or only caught the back end of the answer. When should a student start writing their personal statement for grad school typically?
On some level I think Darla wrote something about that. On some level, it's going to be a personal, like, how do you work? But you do want to give yourself time for multiple drafts. So you are not going to have time for multiple drafts and people to read it and talking to people about what you're planning to do if you start 1 or 2 weeks in advance of your deadline. So I threw out there 2 months. I think Darla threw out 2 to 3 months. Yes, I think all of us have probably worked with students who are starting, 6 months to a year in advance. And if you can't do that, that's okay. But think about how you work. I know some people work well under pressure, but that just simply is not going to give you time to have other people read it, comment, like help you reflect on your own trajectory. So give yourself enough time for that, whatever that is. And ideally, you want to be able to give a pretty solid draft to your letters of letters of recommendation, or your recommenders. So if you do that math, you need to give them, ideally a month to write their letters, even though they do it right before the deadline. So you need to really have a solid draft by a month out.
I think with that said,
thank you.
too, I
go
think
ahead,
I'm sorry to interrupt. But I think with that said too, is just going in with the mindset of like being open and to embrace the fact that this is going to take multiple drafts. And not only be okay with that, but also enjoy the development in the process. And know that your personal statement is always going to be evolving and always going to be a part of you. I know that recently I had to do an advising philosophy. So what came from doing a personal statement to an advising philosophy, I still gave myself the time, but also sought advice from my dear colleague who is in the audience. And just know that you need to give yourself the time to give shape to your statement and also seek out help from others to help continue to develop your statement. So I know for a lot of PPHA students, we do work with you about a year out from your application to help you get into the groove of developing your personal statement, being in that reflective mode, and then kind of like giving you feedback in between. So give yourself time too.
I'd add on to that a bit in terms of the time question, because it does vary from program to program. But as an example, a pretty common window of time for grad school applications closes somewhere in December. So if you think about what you're doing right now and what's coming up, say next month, which can be a very busy time, right? Midterms, break, final exams. Is that also when you want to be writing a personal statement of multiple drafts? So the earlier the better, I think, is the key thing here. Know what the deadline is, work backwards from there. And also something, I'm curious what you all think, but I've come to recognize, because I've seen a lot of really well done writing that's just not hitting the questions in the right way. I think that's because folks are trained to write research papers, academic essays, a particular type of writing outside of maybe creative writing folks, I don't know. We're not really trained to write personal statements about ourselves. So that's why I think it also complicates and makes this a multiple draft kind of thing, because it's uncomfortable, it's disorienting, you don't know where to start, but once you get going, it will be fine.
Is there anything that we did not answer in the chat? I think we got, so Kieran had a question, but Darla responded to that. So I think, anything else?
I think we're good.
Bob, somebody asked about how they'll get copies of the slides and the recording. Is this sent to people or is it posted somewhere?
Right, as long as someone's registered for this event, you'll get a notification through Handshake when we have the recording available and where you can get it. So give me a couple of days, we'll get that done.
A point that I would like to make too for anybody who is pre-health in the audience and want to get a little exercise in reflective writing, we do have some worksheets available on our PPHA Canvas site. under the personal statement module. I would also say too, that by completing an e-portfolio, it does get you into a more reflective writing zone too. So if you're pre-health and wanted to take a look at those, they are on our Canvas site.
And I just posted in chat, I think the Career Center and Fellowships Advising, we both of our offices do our scheduling through Handshake. So that would cover us. Darla gave out her email address. And Kim, I don't know if you want to give out your, okay, it looks like
Yep.
she is. Thanks for coming, everybody. And I'm available for a couple minutes if anyone has a question that they didn't want to answer to the full group. I think we can probably stick around.
Yeah, I'll stop recording right now. Thank you, everyone.